to this podcast on neurodiversity. So I'm Ruth and I'm one of the study skills advisors here at the University of Law, and I am specialising in working with students with SPLDs. And my background, I suppose, a bit like yours really, Jessica, is sort of personal and professional.
Yeah, thanks, Lou. So my name's Jessica and I am one of the mental health advisors here based at ULaw, kind of primarily supporting students with their mental health on a one-to-one basis, but also doing things like this podcast and workshops and some preventative work. So and similarly to you, Ruth, when it comes to kind of neurodiversity, I have a professional background in terms of working both within the NHS and higher education, students with neurodevelopmental conditions and mental health conditions, as well as some kind of lived experience with that myself also.
Yeah. So I think, one of the things I think we're seeing more and more these days, both at the university and I think in the media as well, is people getting late diagnoses and adult diagnoses of particularly things like ADHD. And I think there's lots of reasons, aren't there, really, why it ends up happening at university rather than earlier on. I mean, some people do get diagnosed at school, but, we are seeing more and more people getting diagnosed at university, aren't we?
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, and I think the process of obtaining a diagnosis of a neurodevelopmental condition or a disability such as you mentioned, ADHD, autism, a specific learning difficulty, I think the process can be one that's filled with a lot of emotion. It can be something that can take a lot of decision making before deciding that you would like to kind of go down the route of diagnosis. Whereas for some other people, it might be something that they've thought is their whole life, and just because of perhaps financial constraints or because of the education they've been in so far, not being able to obtain some kind of assessment as to why, and that's why they're going down that route later. So I think it is definitely something that, and as you say, there's definitely an increase in the media. So whether that's social media or whether that's news outlets, there's definitely a lot more talk of an awareness of things like autism and ADHD, which I think is it's a real positive that we're as a society we're becoming more aware of the impacts of these conditions and so on. But it can also mean that there's a lot of information out there, and that can be quite overwhelming. I think a diagnosis can be quite a major thing in terms of having what some people would describe as a label, that is with you for the rest of your life. So it's so that when there's a lot of information out there that might be suggesting, you might read something and you think, that's making me think that I might have that condition. It can be quite overwhelming when you've got loads and loads of information. So I think something that's really important about obtaining a diagnosis is taking your time to kind of gather what I guess I would call a bit of psychoeducation. And that's more just, kind of finding out a little bit about that condition, and whether that's, doing a bit of research of your own, or whether that's talking to your GP or maybe the disability or mental health services within the university to find out a little bit more about those conditions and what a diagnosis would mean for you is really important, so that you can make an informed choice. It's definitely, it can be quite a major thing, but it can be really, really helpful for some people. That's certainly my experience of working with students who have maybe gotten a late diagnosis. A lot of the time they found that quite helpful because it's helped them understand a bit more about who they are and what they struggle with. I think it's interesting that there used to be this thing where they would say, don't let your dyslexia or your define you. This used to be said a lot. And it was very well meant, I think, when people said that. But actually, if you speak to most neurodivergent people, they will say to you, well, actually, this really does form part of my identity. It's part of my everyday life and my everyday life experience. So actually, to a point, it is about embracing it. And I think, as I said, I can see where that used to come from, where people said, don't let it, but actually this acceptance that you refer to is really, really important. I mean, similar to what you've just said, I think, what I see as well with students who
who've got a diagnosis as an adult or a young adult, I often talk about relief and grief. It's this kind of relief and grief process where there's an element, isn't there, of relief, because I think, as you've said, lots and lots of things that you might have carried with you for a lot of your life. So I'm not very organised. I'm a bit this. I'm not as clever as everybody else. I'm, sort of lots of internalized beliefs. I think it can suddenly be that kind of, okay, so there's a reason. So there's a neurobiological reason why I find it's not because of that. So there's a lot of relief, I think. And I think, we'll talk a little bit later on about some of the mental health issues that can come with it. But I think the grief side, so there's a relief, but I think there is an element of grief then. And I think there is an element of where you're going back and saying, okay, so that now I can reframe that. I can see that in a different way. Yeah. And some people feel quite sad for the person, for example, at school who sat and thought, well, why am I reading more slowly than everybody else? What is this? Is it because I'm not this, And I think just with the kind of why are so many people getting diagnosed at university, I think from my point, from just the way I sort of see things, I suppose, is that I think when you're at school, a lot of sort of executive functioning is done for you. So if you think about it, what subject are you going to do when? What room are you in? When are you doing your homework? Do this now. Is sort of buffered a bit by teachers and parents, isn't it? Everything's sort of organised. You're not having to think about cooking for yourself as well and all of that sort of stuff. And I think when you become a young adult, all of these other things come in. And I think that, and if you think about university study, you've got to be very independent. You've suddenly got to be a very independent learner, haven't you? And you've got to kind of, there aren't those things in place. You've got to kind of do it on. I think sometimes that can be where some of the things that maybe worked and you were okay with and you got through school don't work anymore.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really good point, Ruth. And I suppose that kind of touches on actually the kind of point that I think we were going to maybe touch on next around disclosing, because it might be, I think with disclosing sort of neurodevelopmental condition or a disability, it can be something. So this, if you've got a diagnosis already in place and you're thinking about disclosing that to the university, it can be a little bit confusing as to why you might need to do that and what the reasons might be. And I remember that actually, I think it was during my training when I was training as a nurse, and when we were being kind of taught a lesson on ADHD, and I remember seeing a really interesting sort of video or article, and it basically outlined somebody who had mental health problems throughout their life, and when they were diagnosed with ADHD and autism kind of in their early 20s, they described it as a light bulb moment, which I thought was a really nice phrase to use, because it was almost like the fog had lifted a little bit in terms of, not everything's fixed, not everything can be, if in inverted commas, cured, because that's not necessary. There's a lot of elements to a neurodevelopmental diagnosis that actually are, can be a positive and can and it makes us who we are. However, there are also a lot of elements to these conditions that, as you've kind of summed up there, Ruth, can actually cause things like imposter syndrome and make you almost feel a little bit sad about a lot of the areas that you've maybe struggled with and not had help with in the past, or assistance with, because as you say, Ruth, the setup of education when we're younger, so for example primary school and high school, is a lot different to the education we might receive as an adult, which would be your college and your university. So I think disclosing a diagnosis might be something that people have actually never really had to consider until they maybe get to the point where they're in a university degree or they're in kind of full-time employment, because that might be where where, I guess, for want of a better phrase, cracks might start to show in terms of, okay, well, now I don't have the scaffolding around me that I had in high school. I'm actually struggling a little bit more than I thought I would. And that's not to say that, that has to be a negative. It might just mean that actually now disclosing a diagnosis to your university or your employer may help you, because there's actually assistance and support and adjustments out there available that a lot of people don't realise are there. So for example, within once a kind of a diagnosis is disclosed to a disability service within your university, and once that kind of medical evidence is provided and a student has kind of said that and a plan has been put in place, there's actually a range of things that in line with the Equality Act. So, when we're thinking from a legal perspective, this is actually something that, you have as somebody with a disability or a neurodevelopmental condition that you are entitled to. And some of those adjustments can be things like extra time and can be things like getting, pre-approved concessions for the assignments. And it's not to say that these things will sort of fix everything, but coming back to that statement around the light bulb moment, it might be that actually these little adjustments are just helping bridge the gap between you as a student struggling a lot and maybe just only struggling a little bit, or actually feeling like, no, I'm on top of things now. These adjustments might just help bridge that gap. So I think when students think a lot about disclosing a diagnosis, they might be thinking to themselves, well, why? What's the actual point? If anything, this label is now just going to be next to my name. But actually, I encourage students to look at it from a different perspective of not that label just being next to your name now with a big red stamp, every time you walk into exam, oh, that's someone with ADHD, or oh, that's the dyslexic person. No, it's not like that. Within support services, our aim for students to disclose is actually so that we can get that support in place for them. So it's just trying to rephrase those doubts that students might have around disclosing, I think.
Yeah, and I think the way I often describe the reasonable adjustments to students, I used to sort of put it visually in the past with training, and it's about, look, what we're doing, what these adjustments do is put you at the same starting point as everybody else in an exam. Because actually, for example, if you're dyslexic, if you think about a running track, I mean, I'm a very visual thinker. My students know I think in metaphors and images. No,
I'm similar. I'm similar.
But me and my metaphors and my analogies, anyway. But if you think about a running track, I suppose the way I often describe it is, if you're dyslexic, you're going to have to run possibly 1.5 to twice the way round the track in the same time as a person runs once round. You see what I mean? You're going to have to be doing more laps to process and read the same thing. What the reasonable adjustments do and what the extra time does is say, okay, so you have to do 1.5 laps while everyone else does 1. So what we're going to do is give you extra time so you can do that. So it's that kind of, so that it's putting on a level playing field. When I first worked with students, I remember years ago, students would often say, but is it cheating? I mean, maybe is it, I might, or my friend says you've got an unfair advantage because you've got extra time. And I think sometimes people have to just reframe that within themselves even and say, no, this is what I need. This is not me getting an unfair advantage. So I think there's an element sometimes, I think, of even within the student to kind of reframe and go, no, it's okay. And this isn't, this isn't cheating. I think in terms of disclosing, I think it's really interesting what you said, Jessica, and I agree with that. I think disclosure can be so empowering and it can lead to lots and lots of support and help. But I think that particularly perhaps those students who work, I think that can be a bit more of a conundrum of disclosing at work. I think it's not always, I wish we lived in an ideal world where every student was safe to disclose at work. But I think that a lot of people are not safe, don't feel safe to disclose at work. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons I wonder is that I think there's certain value judgments I think we have in society, don't we? About if you think about job applications, it's all about highly organised, organisational skills, and things like a good memory and, that sort of stuff. And all these things are very, written and spoken English is often put on job applications, isn't it? You think? And so if you struggle with, grammar or spelling or that sort of stuff, and you might think, oh, I'm going to be found out. You referred to imposter syndrome. And I think, so I think there's a lot of value judgments placed on these things. So if you struggle with things like, organisation, planning, working memory, I think people can feel worried about disclosing that, because there are these judgments. So I think it's even more important what you were saying about, you know, having that support, finding those strategies so that you feel more confident, so you're not living with that, oh my goodness, is my employer at some point going to, quote, find me out, in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think, you know, and I suppose that kind of comes into thinking about, you know, my lived experience of this sort of thing. I mean, and I don't mind kind of sharing this on the podcast, as somebody who's worked obviously within this field, but as somebody who had a late diagnosis of ADHD myself, so just you know, kind of around about a year and a half ago, I think it was a really interesting perspective for me to have worked, you know, within these services and be sort of encouraging certain things and to be encouraging students and when I worked in the NHS, my patients to, you know, do X, Y, and Z, and to disclose this, and to obtain this kind of diagnosis, and to go down this route. And then actually kind of going through that myself, I think it really helped me it really enlightened me in terms of getting a perspective from the service user rather than the service specialist, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And I think something that, you know, a couple of things that have come from that experience for me is about, one, acknowledging those challenges that we've mentioned around getting a diagnosis and disclosing. So certainly, you know, I think, and also around that relief and grief aspect that you've mentioned, you know, when I think back to studying as a student, I think of times that I know fine well, if I had a diagnosis in place then, I probably, you know, and I probably would have managed a little bit better with some things. But likewise, it's also made me kind of have to think about disclosure now, and not being a student and being in employment. I completely relate to that feeling of, you know, should I do this? Is this the right thing to do? And what will the implications be for me? And I think when I was diagnosed, I was in a really I'm saying a fortunate position. As you say, in an ideal world, it wouldn't be fortunate, and every workplace would be like this. But at the time when I was diagnosed in the place I was working, I had a really supportive manager, and we kind of sat down in a one-to-one together, and we formulated a little bit of a plan around things like rest breaks and stuff. And I, you know, made the decision to let some of my team members know that, you know, these rest breaks are now kind of part of there as an adjustment to my work, and everyone was super supportive. However, that situation has also made me realise just how nerve-wracking that can be, and that maybe not every employer is going to maybe have that reaction, or I'd hope that they would, but I completely understand now why people might be worried about that. And I think it's really important as professionals for us to acknowledge some of those barriers and some of those concerns that the student has, so that we can not only hopefully put their mind at ease with some things, but also you know, it's about having that empathy to understand that this is actually quite a big deal for a lot of people, and this is and it comes back to what we mentioned about getting a diagnosis in the first place. It's a big decision to make, and obviously when it comes to mental health conditions, I know this through my line of work, that sometimes with mental health conditions, the decision is, the autonomy is taken away, the decision is taken away, because somebody might be so unwell that they are perhaps sectioned, or they're in hospital and it's not their decision to do that because they're so unwell, and a diagnosis is sort of formulated that way. And I think that can be really, you know, that can be really challenging for people when a diagnosis is perhaps not their decision to make in terms of disclosing it, because they might disagree with that. However, if you're in a position to if somebody is in a position to obtain a diagnosis and to go down that route with full autonomy and make that decision, I think, you know, it's something that all services, whether that's NHS or within the university, that we can support with, and that we can provide also that emotional support. And that's what, I guess, where mental health and well-being comes into it, because it can be an emotional process.
And I think absolutely. And I think, I think as much as it's really great that there is a lot more awareness and there's a lot more information now in social media and the media, and information, and even academic research now is catching up a little bit in terms of it being accurate and gradually for example, if we think about autistic research into autism, traditionally it's been very much about people who are not, there was no involvement from autistic people, but we're seeing their change now, and that's all really positive, I think. But I think there's still, unfortunately, I was just going back to disclosing, I think unfortunately there's still quite a few myths around, and I think not quite as much awareness as perhaps we'd like at the moment. And I think, but I think if we turn that around, I think if people are brave enough, I suppose, to disclose, it can often be a massive. I've spoken to students who've disclosed at their law firm, for example, and they've really educated people. You know, they've educated their employer, and they've said, and their employer's been like, oh, that's great, thank you, because now I understand, and that's fine. And, you know, so I think I don't think it should always be obviously on the person to do the educating, because that's quite onerous. But I think it's often made employers, they've said, oh, my boss went and read about stuff and went to kind of, you know, and I think that, you know, it can be that. But I think also, again, just coming back to something that you were saying about acknowledging the challenges, which is really important. And I think my personal view, and this is just my personal view, that's all. But I think there's been a lot of stuff, again, in the media and stuff about things like dyslexia and ADHD being, quote, superpowers. And my own view is just that I'm not sure that's where I sit with it, just because I think that it doesn't quite acknowledge what I feel can be very, very real challenges for people, which but likewise, if we go to the opposite one, which gets peddled a little bit, is this, oh, it's a tragedy. It's a disaster, it's a tragedy, it's a life sentence, it's this sort of, you know. So I think where I try and sit, and where I suppose I encourage students to sit perhaps a bit more, is somewhere in the middle, where you're going, you know, this, I need to think, I understand the challenges that I have, but equally, by doing so, get the strategies that work for me, and then really focus on what my strengths are and what strengths this can bring.
Yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant point, actually, because and I remember working within the NHS. It was children I worked with, and it's quite interesting, because obviously when you're working with children versus working with adults, the language you use is often quite different. And it was quite eye-opening for me to work in children's services, and then to work in services that are predominantly adults or young adults. To notice how that kind of that language shifts from very much in schools and things. That language is a lot more around, as you mentioned, using phrases like your superpower and putting that sort of spin on it. Whereas working, you know, with adults, it's a lot more about saying, well, actually, we do recognise that there are some difficulties, but we also hope that you will recognise some of those strengths that you have as well. So I think it definitely depends on where you're at in your journey of life, if that makes sense, as to where you're diagnosed, as to how the approach that you want to take should be, or how the approach that the people around you take. And I think that's probably where some of that stigma, getting a diagnosis as an adult, versus getting it as a child, can come in. Because I think with children, we want to, you know, just naturally, you know, parents and teachers and all these different things want to sugarcoat things just because as a child you have a level of understanding that an adult doesn't. Whereas with adults, getting a diagnosis, it might feel a little bit more like black and white. Well, this is it. This is your label. This is, you know, say this is the treatment. This is what you need to do. But actually, I think, like you've mentioned, it's about, no matter what the age is, it's really important to find that balance of empathy, understanding, and allowing that person to acknowledge some of the grief from those difficulties they've had, plus acknowledging the difficulties that they may continue to have, whilst also acknowledging the benefits of a diagnosis. I think, that balance is really important, and and just trying to use language as a society. I know this is more of a wider systemic sort of thing, but trying to get language ingrained in society that actually is doesn't leave people feeling sort of what's the word I'm thinking of? I guess leaving people to feel
less than or deficit. I think there used to be this deficit. I used to call it the deficit approach, wasn't it? Where it was all about, oh, well, you can't do this and you struggle with this. And I think even the diagnostic process is still quite deficit based, isn't it?
Definitely.
It's kind of like, so you fill in questionnaires and it's like, well, you can't do this, you struggle with this, and it's very, very deficit based. So I think post-diagnostic support, which is a lot of what we either formally or informally do with students in different ways, I think has to be a bit less of that. It has to be a bit more neutral, and I think what we both probably, it's all about understanding that your brain works differently. That's all. It's a difference. That's all.
No, absolutely. And I think I think that's a really good point you made about the diagnostic process and the negatives. And I think that comes into some of the things that we were mentioning about obtaining a neurodiagnosis and being actually prepared for that and understanding of what that process is, and it's not to put people off of it, but it's just because actually and I remember when I used to do the assessments within children's services, and I would sit down with the parent and the child, and one of the first things I'd say is, by the way, just a quick disclaimer, this assessment is going to focus a bit on the negatives, and that doesn't mean that I feel any type of way, or that you guys should feel any type of way of that. Unfortunately, when it comes down to the crux of it in terms of the black and white sort of diagnostic criteria that a doctor or a pediatrician or a psychologist has to use to make that diagnosis, they unfortunately just have to look at the impairment. And I think that's the big phrase that's used during the diagnostic process is pervasive impairment. So, for those listening that maybe don't know what that means, essentially what that is looking at, is this person impaired in pervasively throughout different aspects of their life. So, for example, academically, employment, so in education, in their personal life, in relationships. And it might mean that process can be a little bit draining, because you're having to bring all these things up and discuss them. But that is definitely how the sort of medical model of diagnosis is still today. So I think it's really worth, for those thinking about getting a diagnosis or going down that route, just to be aware that might be quite an emotional process, and that doesn't necessarily mean that this is a huge negative thing. It just means that in that process, unfortunately, that is something that has to be covered. And I hope that as a society and, within the healthcare system and so on, as we progress, because even within the last 10 years, I mean, I remember, as somebody that's 26 years old, 10 years ago, I was in high school, and I remember, apart from maybe boys, and the boys will be boys and bad behavior, and it would be, oh, that person has ADHD because they're really loud and things. Apart from that, there was nothing even in school that I was aware of, and that was only 10 years ago. So I think of the kind of leaps and the improvements we've made since then, but we're not quite there yet.
No.
But it does make me hopeful that we're getting a bit more to a place that actually it's getting that destigmatized, hopefully, anyway.
Absolutely. And I think ADHD, for example, was very much seen as a behavioural condition, which of course it isn't. So it's a and I think, as I said, when I often with students, if they've had a diagnosis, I mean, one of the things I'm helping them to understand is how they learn and the things that they find difficult. So I'll always preface that by saying, I'm going to ask you what you find difficult and what you're struggling with in your study at the moment. But that's not me entirely focusing on negatives, but it's just in order to help. I think there is a process where you've got to say, okay, so what am I struggling with? What am I finding difficult? Is it the workshop prep? Is it the reading? Is it, and then understanding that can then lead to the strategies. And I'm sure it's a similar process with mental health issues, but it's this kind of like understanding first And then you can start with the strategies. And one of the things I was going to say, you've mentioned empathy, but I think one of the things that is also really, really important for people is to develop self-compassion. Because
absolutely,
I think what I find is students, neurodivergent students who've had a late diagnosis have often not been they've not been very compassionate to themselves for lots of reasons. So they're more likely to be very hard on themselves, to be very, have put really high expectations on themselves. So I think something to nurture, and I think we both do this in our different roles, is to nurture that self-compassion.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a good point. And I think it's definitely a big part of working as somebody who works. My main focus is mental health. So I work with a lot of students, or I have worked with a lot of students who they have a comorbidity of a mental health condition, as well as either a disability or a physical health condition or an SPLD or the neurodevelopmental condition. So I work with a lot of, and what I mean by comorbidities, for those listening who aren't aware, I guess what I mean by that is just two conditions that maybe go a bit hand in hand, and kind of feed into each other a little bit. And a perfect example of that is something like ADHD and autism alongside something like anxiety or depression.
Absolutely.
And it might be that somebody's come to me as a mental health professional to manage their anxiety, and then after the few sessions, we maybe start discussing things like, well, let's have a little think about what's triggering that anxiety. Okay, so we've now been able to, we've now done together a bit of a thought diary, and we've tracked your thoughts and your feelings for the last week. And actually, I can see from this thought diary that your anxiety seems to spike when you're getting ready to study, or when you're about to go into class, or, things like that. And then we can kind of unpick that a little bit and say, okay, well, what's maybe causing that anxiety? Oh, so it's that you're worried because you really struggle to concentrate. Okay, well, let's unpick that. So I think when there's mental health and either possible or diagnosed kind of neurodivergency in the mix, it's really important to be aware of how those things can coexist, I suppose, and just to be aware that it may be, it may be that you've been struggling with something relating to your mental health for some time, and actually say an underlying autism is actually what's maybe causing some of those mental health difficulties, or vice versa. It may be that you have a diagnosis of ADHD and you've maybe been putting things down to concentration and focus issues, but actually your anxiety is at play as well, and you're feeling really anxious about things. So I think that self-compassion is so important because developing that self-compassion, or trying to build on it and improve on it. And that's why a lot of my work is around actually learning those triggers and trying to manage those and trying to improve on those. Because actually mental health conditions and disabilities, or SPLDs and so on, as I've mentioned, do go hand in hand and can impact each other, so that self-compassion is really important, and self-care and relearning some of those self-care kind of strategies to really be a bit more easy on yourself when you have these diagnoses is so important.
Yeah, and I think if you think that anxiety, I mean, what we know now, for example, with ADHD, is that in a lot of people, hyperactive mind is ADHD. Hyperactive mind often, unfortunately, turns into anxiety. So it's a kind of, there's a kind of, what we used to think was just anxiety and it is hyperactive mind. But I think I think you're right. I think it's about almost relearning how you see yourself. And I think, I from my side of things, I see students with what I call a poor academic self-concept, which sounds like a big word, but your academic self-concept is basically how you see yourself academically, and for a lot of students that I work with, they'll say, oh, but I'm just not as good as the other students. I'm just slower. I'm just not as organized. I'm just, there's a real kind of like, I'm just not as good. And I think that that's something that really takes work, where you've got to kind of go, wait a minute, I can be just as good a student and successful and do just as well as the other students in my class. But my journey to get there, to pass my LLB, my LPC, whatever it is, my journey is going to be different. My path to get there is going to have to be different. And I'm going to have to use different strategies. So one of the things I often, if we're just thinking about strategies, I suppose, is to think really, really, like you've said, about understanding yourself psychologically. I think with my side of things, it's about saying, look, how do you learn best? Yeah. And if the way that you learn is going to be really different to the way that other people learn in your class. So, for example, certain strategies, that study skill strategies, sometimes generic ones, don't work for neurodivergent people. They just don't work. Yeah. So, for example, sometimes we get told things like, well, okay, make a timetable. 9 till 10, 11 till 1, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. That's too onerous a lot of the time for neurodivergent people, and it's too, so it's got to be, you've got to reduce the demand a little bit, and certain things don't work. So I think it's about, a lot of my work is about, well, let's think about how you work best. Let's think about what works. Let's think about what you're good at. And let's just ditch what doesn't work. It's not going to work for you. Things like, schedules, things like, mind maps. Mind maps can be brilliant for some people, but they're dreadful. They don't work at all for other people. Yeah. I think things like, Pomodoro, where you work in sort of 20, 30 minutes, take a break, 20, 30, which again can be brilliant for some people, but it absolutely doesn't work at all for other people. So I think it's just, and your environment and all of those things. So I think one of the things is understanding how you work best. And I think that's something that, is really, really important, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I think just, and again, thinking about lived experience as well as with the students that I've worked with, I think it's really important to recognise that not one size fits all. And that's where it comes in terms of, I suppose, just thinking about touching on how to access support for ULaw students. Yeah. I think that's where it comes in what we were mentioning about disclosing, and maybe not putting aside, I guess, the employment aspect, but thinking about from university point of view, that is where disclosing can be really helpful, because those plans that you would, so let's just say, for argument's sake, somebody sort of discloses a diagnosis of dyslexia. Disability advisors are experienced and kind of have a lot of knowledge around dyslexia as a condition. So it's not a case of you would sit down with them and it would be, okay, well, for somebody with dyslexia, you get X, Y, and Z. There you go. That's your help. What it would be is it would be a discussion, and it would be, and because it might actually be that as an individual with dyslexia, you turn around and you say, well, yeah, that extra time would be helpful, but I actually have a lot of strength in this area, and I don't think I need that set level, that adjustment. However, this other one would be really helpful. Yeah. So I think it's about, understanding that everything that it's really important that, especially within disability services and wellbeing services and study skill services and mental health services within ULaw, we all sing from the same hymn sheet of the student is at the centre of that support. Absolutely. And their views are the most important thing. Because as somebody who works within mental health, I have students come to me and they're talking to me, maybe about their mental health and getting some support around that. But in conversation with me, they just mentioned that they have another kind of diagnosis, whether that's, say ADHD or something. And they already know about the disability service, but they've chosen not to address that. And they've chosen to maybe come to me for mental health, but they've chosen not to. And then I kind of maybe will talk to them about why that is and unpick that a little bit, and, obviously offer any advice or support around disclosing that I can. But I think, because we have to acknowledge that not everybody that comes our way is going to want to get that support or want to get that disclosure. So it's just barriers why people might be,
not wanting. And I think also, I think there's an idea about getting help. I think for a lot of people, it's just that kind of feeling of, well, I should be able to do this by myself. And in the sense of seeking help and getting help and admitting that I'm struggling is a sign of weakness. And I think there are still some narratives around that, aren't there, where it's like, oh, you know, that seeking help is a sign that I'm not coping and I should be able to do this myself. Just to end on, Jessica, I suppose what I'm quite keen to do is just, I know we've talked about a lot of the challenges that can come, which are very real, you know, with a neurodivergent condition. But I also want to say, look, there are so many strengths that you bring to your university classroom and your campus, because, you know, you are likely incredibly creative, creative problem solvers. My goodness, if you want somebody to creatively solve a problem, you want a neurodivergent person on your team. Yeah,
definitely.
Bigger picture thinkers. You know, so there's so many strengths, and I think, you know, which again you can embrace and think, well, actually, I'm bringing something to the table here as well.
Yeah, that's so true, and it's a lovely point to kind of round up the discussion. And I think, you know, that's. And I guess that kind of touches on, you know, what we were mentioning earlier around, you know, these phases of versus, you know, superpower versus all the negatives, but actually finding that balance of, you know, of a bit of both. And I think that's, you know, that is so important, because certainly, not even just academically. So as you've mentioned, academically, there's a lot of things that somebody who has a neurodivergent brain can bring to the table, but also in terms of personal life and relationships and things. Personality-wise, I know I wouldn't be the Jessica that everybody knows if I didn't have my hyperactivity and wasn't a chatty Sally like I am. So I can definitely attest to that when getting a diagnosis, it can also be quite nice to just learn, you know, to understand that some of these things that you've maybe been a bit hard on yourself for can actually be real strengths, and and can actually make you. And that's the main thing, is that with all individuals, and I think that's actually what, you know, all this awareness and destigmatization of neurodivergent conditions is actually about, is actually saying we are all unique. So even though there's labels here, with actually we really are all we all unique, and we all have our own strengths. And if anything, any label that is given when it comes to as a diagnosis, that's just you know, it's just another layer to you as a person and what you can bring to the table. So yeah, I think that's a really nice way to round up the conversation, Ruth.
Thank you to everyone listening and who's listened today.